Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by IOP Publishing. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed for you. We welcome your questions and you will have the opportunity to submit them by typing them into the question pane of your control panel. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end. Our speaker today is Tom Sharp, a publisher in the journal's development team at IOP Publishing. Tom will be giving a 45-minute presentation all about how to get your research published if you're a German author. He will cover the open access publishing options available thanks to funding agreements in Germany. So over to Tom for the presentation.
Hi everybody, thank you very much for joining and thanks Emma for the introduction. As Emma mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about how to get your research published. A lot of what I'm saying will be applicable to researchers all around the globe, but I'm also going to run through some very specific points which apply specifically to German researchers as well. So, a quick overview of what we'll be going through today, a little bit of an overview of IOP and IOP Publishing, why you should consider publishing at all, how to choose your journal, which is an extremely important point, some specific open access information for German researchers, how to actually write your paper, a few top tips on getting it published, an overview of the peer review process, which I think is a really important thing for researchers to understand, a bit about publication ethics, and then what to do after your work is accepted and after it's been published. So firstly, a quick introduction to IOP. So IOP Publishing is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Institute of Physics. So all of the money that we make through our publishing activities is then gift aided to the Institute, who then use that to promote physics around the world and encourage people to study it. So we're a society publisher very much embedded in the physics community, and our mission is to deliver impact, recognition and value to the scientific community. So we're based here in Bristol, where I'm talking to you today. And we publish around 80 physical sciences journals and also have an ebooks program. And you might be familiar with our physics journalism site, Physics World, which is one of the world leading physics news platforms. So we have people based all around the world. We're very much a global company. We're not just based in the UK. So if you do tend to go and attend conferences, you're likely to see us there. So, why should you publish at all? So publishing and scientific publishers have an extremely important part to play in science itself. After all, it is about the dissemination of knowledge and your results. It's an important process for validating your research, building your own career and reputation, and publishing in peer-reviewed, reputable journals is pretty much the universal way in which scientists communicate their research with one another. Obviously, we also have sort of preprint servers and things like that, but the peer review process is an integral part of validating research and giving researchers an indicator of what they can believe. And choosing your journal is one of the most important steps in deciding where you're going to publish and how you should write your research. It's not a decision to take lightly. Unfortunately, not all publishers can be trusted these days. You may end up getting quite a few emails from predatory journals encouraging you to pay to publish. So I very much recommend doing a bit of research and exploring the publisher and the journal that you're interested in publishing beforehand. There's very many considerations that will affect your choice of journal. The scope of the journal, its reputation and with your peers, its intended audience, etc. So I'm going to run through a few of those things in a moment. It's very important that you decide where you'd like to publish before you start putting your paper together. I can't stress that enough because after all, you're tailoring your particular paper and your message to your intended audience and the requirements of that journal. So as a publisher, we try and make it as easy as possible to publish with us. So we've got journals to cover pretty much every topic within physical sciences and to meet the needs of researchers at every stage of their career. So what should you consider when you're choosing your journal? The first few points here basically are linked to the intended audience of your work. So who would you like to read it? Do your peers read the journal? Is the scope relevant to your work? It's very important to consider whether you're going for a niche or a broad scope journal, because that will very much dictate how you structure your paper and the message that you try and get across. Definitely take a look at the editorial board of the journal. They should publish this on their website. So these are a panel of experts which they will consult in order to help manage the peer review process and the aims of the journal. Do you recognize any of your peers on there? Are there some big names within your field? Because they're the sort of people that you'd like to see on there. And also have a think about the reputation of the journal within your particular community. Impact factor is probably a term that you hear a lot as researchers, and it's an almost universally accepted means of judging how high impact the research is published within a particular journal. So how many citations is it likely to pick up? It's not the only quality criteria that you should look at, though. Definitely take a look at the speed of publication. Some journals take much longer than others, so if you want to get a piece of research out quickly, definitely look at that. And have a think about the likelihood of acceptance. Some high-impact journals have incredibly high reject rates, up around 90%. So if you do want to get your research out there quickly, have a think about that. There's also lots of different types of open access and subscription models, which I'm going to run through in a little bit. So think about those, and also think about the costs. So some journals will charge in terms of pages or color figures, things like that. So have a think about how you might cover those costs. Do you have funding in place through your institution to cover them? And there's a very handy website here called Think, Check, Submit, which runs through some of these pieces of information in a checklist. I definitely recommend that you have a look there. It'll help you navigate the world of publishing a bit and watch out for predatory journals. So a little bit about impact factor. Basically, it's a measure of the average number of citations that an article is likely to pick up in the 2 years after it's published. It's not a perfect metric by any means, but it is sort of universally used among journals. For instance, if we take an example here, if a journal publishes 175 articles in 2015, 212 in 2016, in 2017 it then goes on to receive 943 citations on these articles. You can see that the impact factor is calculated by dividing the total number of citations by the number of articles published in those 2 years to give the impact factor. So it's a rolling average over a 2-year period. It's also good to look at alternative metrics, so the download levels and other metrics such as Altmetrics, which is a very useful service which basically keeps track of how frequently an article is shared on social media. Very useful to keep an eye on your own work to see who's sharing it. So we have a huge range of journals at IOP Publishing, and I think it's important to consider the tiering of journals when you're looking at impact factor. So impact factor is very field specific. So for instance, cancer and oncology journals tend to have incredibly high impact because the work in those fields is more likely to pick up more citations. Whereas, for instance, take New Journal of Physics, one of our titles has an impact factor of around 3.7. That's actually a pretty good impact factor for a physics journal. So it's important to contextualize impact factor within your field of research. So at IOP, we tend to have tiers of journals. We have very high impact journals, such as 2D Materials, which have very high reject rates and high quality standards. We have mid-tier journals, similar to Journal of Physics Condensed Matter and New Journal of Physics. But we also have our express titles, which have very low novelty standards, but so they will accept work as long as it is scientifically correct. It doesn't have to adhere to a particular impact threshold at all. So you can see that depending on the impact of your work, there are plenty of venues for it. If you don't think it's going to get into a high impact journal, you may like to consider a slightly lower impact one, and this is going to dictate how you write up your paper as well. It's definitely very important to consider your open access options. So a lot of journals are traditionally published through a subscription model. That is, that libraries and institutions will buy a subscription, and then everybody within that institution has access to everything published in that journal. So that means that it's free to publish for researchers, and the libraries themselves pay for access. So normally authors are allowed to self-archive their work on a repository after an embargo period, so typically 12 months, and this is called green open access. So all of our IOP titles are green open access. We also have gold open access titles, so this is what people typically refer to as fully open access journals. This is where the final published article is made freely available to everybody upon a payment which comes from the author or their institution. So that APC, or article processing charge, is paid to the publisher at the point of acceptance, and after that point, the work is published under a CC BY license allowing reuse. So we have many journals which are gold open access, and almost all of our other titles, our subscription titles, are actually hybrid, which means that you can choose to publish fully open access within those subscription journals. So in Germany, we have some institutional agreements in place, which means that open access is available to authors at no additional costs. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So here's a few examples of journals in our open access portfolio. New Journal of Physics was actually the first fully open access journal. It's very high impact, covering all aspects of physics. We also have Journal of Physics Communication, which is, as I was mentioning about those express titles, has rapid publication, covers all areas of physics, but it doesn't have novelty requirements. As long as something is scientifically correct, it can be published in JPCA. We've also got field-specific titles, so we've got some new OA launches, Journal of Physics Energy, Materials, and Photonics. And we're also launching 2 new open access titles in 2019, one called Machine Learning, Science and Technology, which is very exciting, and another one called Journal of Physics Complexity. So as you can see, there's a huge breadth of open access titles out there covering all areas of research. So this is probably the most important part of the presentation. I'm going to talk to you about open access specifically for German researchers. So we have at IOP have open access agreements in place with the Max Planck Society and the German National Library of Science and Technology, or the TIB. So this means that all work published in IOP journals can be made open access if you come from these institutions at no cost to you. So it's important to check if you're affiliated with a member of the TIB. There's going to be a link at the end of the presentation for you to take a look at and find out more information. So basically, when you submit your work from one of these institutions, it should be automatically picked up in our peer review system, and then that will, at the point of acceptance, you should be made aware that your institution will be covering the open access charge. You can opt out of that process at any time as well. So definitely check with your institution if you have an agreement in place, because you will be able to publish your work fully open access at no cost to yourself. Open access work is typically far more highly downloaded and highly cited, so I would definitely recommend taking up that offer. So there's a few simple steps. So at the submission stage, the corresponding or submitting author must be affiliated with that member institution. So that's important to consider. If you're working with co-authors from many institutions, make sure that the corresponding or submitting author is affiliated with either a Max Planck or a TIB library institution. and make sure that your affiliations are all clearly listed. That will enable us to automatically pick up on that. At first decision, you'll be notified throughout the peer review process, and after the first decision phase, your paper should then be automatically opted into open access, but you can opt out of that if you wish. And after acceptance, IOP will then validate the article through a dedicated contact at your institution, so you don't have to do it. And then the TIB or Max Planck funding will be approved. And if it is declined for any reason, you can then have the option to find alternative funding. We're not just going to refuse to publish the article. So in terms of submission requirements, we try to make it as simple as possible. We don't have any set submission file formats. You can submit in Word, LaTeX, PDF, or zip files, anything basically. You can also submit straight from the archive, so you don't have to worry about that. So every journal has full information on its homepage. I thoroughly recommend that you go and explore these thoroughly, regardless of whether you're publishing with an IOP journal or not. It's important for you to get a feel for the requirements of your journal before you submit, and check out our author guidelines as well. So the link at the bottom of the page here is to our publishing support site. That's very, very handy. It's got lots of information about how to submit to our journals, how to prepare your manuscript, and also has lots of information for reviewers as well. So I thoroughly recommend checking it out. The link will be available at the end of the presentation as well. This is what that publishing support site looks like. So as you can see, you can work your way through the entire submission process with step-by-step guidelines, and we also allow you to sort of keep track of your article once you've submitted it. So it's a very, very handy tool. So on to the nuts and bolts of writing your paper. Before you start, it's important to assess your results, and are they significant and important enough to fill a gap in your field of research, and does that line up with the quality standards of the journal that you plan on publishing? Because as I've said, we've already taken a look at which journals are out there, and we've decided where we want to publish at this stage. Definitely take a look at the submission requirements of your journal. Decide on the key message of your paper. It's very important for you to have a clear narrative within your paper, so that the readers understand what you've done and why it's important. And I would recommend preparing an outline first, going through the main points that you want to discuss, contextualizing them in prior research, and outlining their significance. That will really help when it comes to actually writing your paper. So the structure of academic papers is normally fairly similar, but I would recommend checking this with the journal that you plan to publish in. Typically, you'll have a title and abstract, followed by an introduction, which will contextualize your research within prior published results. The methods, which will enable other researchers to reproduce your results, hopefully. The results and discussion, and the conclusion, which will outline what you've done, why it's important, and compare it to previously published results. And then also the additional information such as references, figures, and optional supplementary material as well. So definitely check the submission requirements of your chosen journal before you get to this stage. So I'm going to talk about the title and abstract first, because I think they are the most important parts of the paper, and you should spend a little bit of time thinking about it. Definitely write the title and abstract last, once you fully understand what results you're going to be including in the paper. The title is the most visible part of your paper. It needs to be concise yet informative and draw the attention of the reader. Importantly, it should be easily discoverable through a Google search. I'm sure if you're anything like me, you don't discover new research by going to a library and flicking through a hard copy of a journal. You probably search in a search engine in order to find it. So you want to make sure that your research is as discoverable as possible. So keep it clear and descriptive, and utilize key terms. So what you've done, what material you've been studying, that sort of thing. Don't be ambiguous or use jokes, because often they don't translate particularly well into other languages. And try and keep acronyms to a minimum, unless they are very well established within your field. The abstract is also vitally important. As I said, make sure you're writing it at the end of your paper so that you know what to include. It's basically the shop window to your research. It's going to be drawing the reader in. It's also, importantly, the only piece of your paper that a peer reviewer can see before deciding whether or not they want to review your article. So the better your abstract, the more likely someone is to want to referee it, which is not often considered. It's important to summarize the entire paper, so it's not just copying your introduction again in a paragraph of about 300 words. Make sure you include keywords and phrases as well, particularly within the first few lines. Search engines actually give more priority to the beginning of a paper, so the first few lines when deciding which search results to return. So make sure you include plenty of key terms in those first few lines. Be clear about what you've done, summarize the aims and the methodology that you've been using, and don't exaggerate your claims or use too much specific jargon at this stage. The introduction is where you're going to clarify all of your acronyms and abbreviations. So try and keep your abstract nice and clear and easy to read. And you also want to summarize your main findings and why they were important. So on to the introduction and the methods. So the introduction is very much contextualizing your work within previously published research. So most of your references should be linked to your introduction. You want to cite all relevant references. Make sure that you've got plenty of recent references in there as well. That's something that we look out for at peer review, to make sure that you've done a thorough literature review. And you want to make sure that your methods give enough information to allow reproduction of your results. Science has a big issue with reproducibility, so you want to make sure that your method section is as clear as possible. Your results and discussion are you're going to not only outline your main findings, but summarize them and make sure you indicate their significance and impact within your field. Compare your results with other previously published work and discuss their implications and applications. The conclusion is going to summarize all of your major points. Here you want to really highlight the novelty and significance of your work and make sure that you discuss any limitations as well as plans for future work. Where might this lead? Because at this point, we're looking to understand why your work is important and where it might lead in the future. Acknowledgements, make sure you recognize the contribution of all of your funders. You should include any specific funding codes that you have at this stage, so make sure you have those available, and make sure you have any ethical approval for your work. So you'll have to state whether or not you've used any animal stem cells, that sort of thing. Your references, make sure that you cite within the correct format for your journal. At IOP, we allow you to submit in pretty much any reference style, so don't worry too much about that. But make sure that they're all legible, easy to understand, correctly ordered, and check for accuracy. So check with the publisher that you are choosing to publish with for the correct style of reference that they want. People tend to use different reference styles for different journals. Your figures are also incredibly important. The main thing is that they should be self-contained. So if you are just presented with the figure and the caption, you should be able to fully understand what that figure is about. Make sure that your figure captions are clear, easy to understand, and that they don't contain too many acronyms, so that someone could understand that figure if they found it through a Google search, for instance. It's also quite useful to consider how it might be used post-publication. So a lot of journals will pick their cover images or work to promote through the images. So you make sure that they're really high quality and nice and clear. We often promote them on social media and things like that. And some journals will offer services such as graphical abstracts. So check those submission requirements beforehand. So before you submit, I think it's a really, really important thing to do to get feedback and comments from your peers before you submit. Go through your supervisor, your colleagues, and your peers. you want to make sure that you're utilizing this because it's free advice. Make sure your work has seen plenty of editing before it gets to that submission stage, because it's likely to save you plenty of time throughout the peer review process. And if you do need help from a native English speaker, I recommend that you get it. And we also offer this service through a partner called Editage. They will do English language edits for you. They're not tied to us, so you don't. If you use them, you don't then have to publish an IOP journal. And they will charge you a small fee depending on the extent of the work. But if you're not a particularly fluent English speaker, that would be a really, really useful service. So, summarizing where we are now with a few top tips. Make sure that you check the literature for similar results in your field first, because you really want to assess what the impact of your work is before you decide where to publish. Make sure you contextualize your work with the newest and most recent references to show why it's significant. Decide whether or not you're writing for a specialist or non-specialist audience before you start writing your paper. That's really important, because obviously you're going to tailor the message in your paper to that specific audience. Choose that journal that you want to publish in before you start writing your paper. That's very important. Spend a lot of time on the title and abstract. This is the shop window to your research, and it's what people are going to see first. So people tend to judge your work on these things. So spend a bit of time on them and write them after you finish the rest of your research. Keep abbreviations and technical terms to a minimum and clearly define them in the first use. Make sure you're not using too many of them in the title and abstract or in your figure captions. Avoid speculation, exaggerations, and anecdotes. Very much keep to the facts. Exaggeration and things like that will be picked up on in the peer review process, so make sure you stick to the facts. Keep it clear and concise, even if there are no word limits. Some of the most high-impact papers of all time are incredibly short. For instance, Watson and Crick's original work around the discovery of the structure of DNA is only about a page long. So don't feel the need to bulk out your work with additional words. Keep it concise and to the point. Allow plenty of time for rewriting and get plenty of feedback from your colleagues before you submit your article. It's free advice, so make sure you use it. So, changing topics a little bit, I'm now going to talk to you about the peer review process. I think it's really important that you have an understanding of this as researchers, because it can be seen as a little bit of a black box that nobody really understands. It's an integral part of scientific research and a vital piece of publishing. It's a critical filter for millions of research articles published every year, and we want to give the community a reliable indicator of what to believe. It's also very important for authors to get feedback and improve their work. And also it helps editors such as myself decide what to publish in our journals. This is what the peer review process looks like at IOP. We tend to run a single blind process, so the referees can see who the author is, but the author can't see who the referees are. I'm going to run through this process in more detail now. So when a piece of work is submitted, we do some initial pre-refereeing checks to make sure that it is suitable for the journal. All work goes through a plagiarism checker to look for pieces of text copied from previous work. That includes your own work. You can't self-plagiarize. So make sure that your work is written in your own words. At this stage, we're mostly looking to see if the work is within the scope of the journal, and we may consult our editorial board if necessary if we're not sure. We can also transfer a paper at this stage if we think it is more suitable to the scope or the novelty standards of another journal. After that, we're going to decide which experts to consult once we send it out for peer review. So referee selection is an extremely important part of the peer review process, because you want to make sure that they are going to give an informative and non-biased report. So we pick our referees from a large online database based on their subject's expertise, their independence, so we won't pick one if they're associated with your institution, their ability to keep track of when they were last invited, and their reliability. So We log all of their reports and we give them a rating, so if people consistently return bad reports, we then won't use them again. We also consider your referee suggestions. So if you do recommend people to referee them within your field, we will consider them, though we will make sure that they're not too closely associated with you to make sure they'll give a non-biased report. So typically we run a single blind peer review service. So the authors will not know who the referee is, but the referees will know who the author is. We've actually started running double-blind peer review on some of our express titles that I mentioned earlier, where the referees also don't know who the author is. The idea behind this is that it's supposed to provide the most unbiased peer review we possibly can. And we're actually also trying something a little bit different called transparent peer review, whereby if the referees and the authors opt in, we will make the referee reports available after publication so that readers can see what changes were made to an article throughout the peer review process. So once we've got those referee reports in, we typically look for 2 referee reports. If those reports disagree, we will consult an adjudicator, often a member of our editorial board, to help us make a decision. Normally this process takes about a month or 2, depending on the journal. So our referees are asked to judge on scientific rigor, novelty and significance. So obviously that will the standards of each will depend on the particular journal. Our editorial team will then make a first decision. You can be accepted at this stage, though it is very unlikely to get accepted straight away. Most papers will go through a series of revisions. And it's important to note that rejection rates can be very high. In fact, over 50% is common for high quality journals. So don't worry if you do get rejected at this stage. Being asked to revise is a great sign. It means that the referees see merit in your work and they think that it could be published. So once you've got those referee reports back, make sure you take some time to read them very carefully. You want to respond to every point that they make, even if you disagree with them. That may involve providing a little bit of additional evidence. Make sure you keep a list of changes and number them in your response so that we can see what changes have been made to the paper, and the referees can see which points you're responding to. It is, of course, possible to disagree with your referees, so clearly and politely explain why you do. If you think that a referee is giving a misguided report and they haven't understood your paper properly, you can also get in touch with the editorial team. So you'll normally have a point of contact that you can get in touch with through email. Make sure that you make any concerns noted, because we will take note of them. And never ignore a comment. If you don't understand it, raise it with the editorial team, and we may go back to the referee for more clarification. This is free advice to improve your paper, so make sure you make the most of it. So after you've revised it, we'll typically send it back to one or more of the same referees, and if they are satisfied at that stage, it can then be accepted. It may also be rejected at this stage if the referees believe that the revisions are not strong enough, or you may be asked to make further revisions. Typically, we won't go through more than 2 or 3 rounds of revision on a paper because it just takes too long. What to do if you get rejected? So everyone has been rejected, and if someone says they haven't been, I don't believe them. Make sure that you use the advice that you've received from your referees to improve your paper. You can rewrite it and resubmit it to another journal, and perhaps consider another tier of journal with different impact and novelty requirements. As I mentioned, we have those different tiers at IOP, suitable for all levels of work. If you think a decision is wrong, you can also appeal it. So typically you'll have a month in order to submit a formal appeal through email. Make sure you clearly describe the issues that you perceive, where you think the referees went wrong. This will normally go to the editorial board or the editor-in-chief of a journal, who will take a look to see if the peer review process was handled correctly. They may give you another chance to revise, or the appeal may be upheld. So if you get accepted, congratulations, you'll get an acceptance letter. If you've published in an IOP journal, and you've opted into our accepted manuscript service, the final accepted version will then be made available within 24 hours. And that will be given the same DOI as the final published version, so you can go ahead and start sharing and citing that work. You'll also have a few more things to do before the final published version goes online. You'll need to sign any copyright forms, provide proof of permissions for any reproduced figures that you might have used from other work, upload your final source files, and if you are choosing to go through transparent peer review, decide whether or not you want the referee report to be published alongside your article. I'm now going to talk a little bit about publication ethics. Very, very important topic. We take examples of serious misconduct and plagiarism very, very seriously at IOP. We're a member of COPE, which is the Committee of Publication Ethics. So they give very clear guidelines on how we should handle misconduct cases. As I said, all research that gets published in our journals goes through a plagiarism checker called Authenticate, which scans for all previously published work and picks out passages of copied text. So you can't actually reproduce your own previously published work as well. It has to be written in your own work, because when that work was published, the copyright was probably assigned to that publisher rather than you. So if we were to then publish that, we'd be breaching copyright. Make sure you check out our ethical policy on our publishing support site. And here are some tips on ethical publishing. So make sure that you are honest with the claims that you make in your research and your conclusions. Don't try and exaggerate your claims. Credit all of those who made a significant contribution. Make sure that they are included on the author list if they made a very significant contribution, or at least acknowledged in the acknowledgements. Check your funder's copyright or open access policy. Make sure you do that before you publish your work, because some funders will have a requirement that all work is to be published open access, and they may even contribute funding in order to cover the costs. Disclose any funding or potential conflicts of interest before you publish. Get permission to reuse anything that you haven't created yourself, including figures. You can normally do that with a simple online form from other publishers. Respond to all reviewers' comments politely, even if you don't agree with them. Make sure you don't fabricate, falsify, or misrepresent your data or results. I don't think that needs much more explaining, really. Make sure you don't submit an article to more than one journal at a time. So if, for instance, you submitted to 2 journals and they both happen to be published, then those journals would be in breach of copyright with one another. Don't add someone as a co-author without their permission. You'll be surprised how often people try and do this, actually. People will try and sneak the name of a Nobel Prize winner onto the end of their paper or something like that in order to make it seem higher impact than it actually is. If they do it through our system, that author will get a notification, so they might be in for a bit of a surprise. Don't sign any forms on behalf of your co-authors unless authorized to do so, and don't duplicate text from other articles, including your own. We will pick up on that using our Authenticate software. And don't take any criticisms of your work personally from referees or be abusive in your reply. Sometimes referees do miss the point. So if you think they've got it wrong, make sure you respond politely and talk to our editorial teams. They'll help you through the process. So what happens post-acceptance? Your accepted manuscript will be made freely available within 24 hours if you opt into that service. You can then promote your work as soon as it is accepted, and it's an early opportunity to get your research read and cited. So make sure you share it with your colleagues and peers. I'm sure they really appreciate you sending them some relevant work. You'll then go through the proof stage. So this is with our production team, who are going to go and turn your accepted article into the polished article that you see online. You can make a few minor corrections at this stage, but they can't be major changes to the paper. They are just quick language edits mostly. They'll give you the quick language edit for you, and at this stage you'll also be checking any mathematical formulae or things like that to make sure that they are correct. You'll be sent a final proof before it goes online, which you'll then have to approve. It will be published online, and a print publication will follow sometime later if your journal is printed. Actually, a lot of new journals are not offered in print format these days. So, what to do once your work has been published? Your work doesn't end there. In fact, I think it's really important to consider how to promote your work once it's been published, and a lot of people don't consider it enough. Make sure you contact your colleagues, send them your work. I'm sure they'd really appreciate having a link to your paper. There's loads of work out there, so having relevant work sent straight to you must be a real advantage. Use social media if you have it. A lot of communities have very active Twitter communities. So, for instance, the computational chemistry community loves Twitter. They're all on there. So I'd recommend getting a professional Twitter account to share your research on there. If you have a blog, make sure you use it and update it. A lot of researchers have their own blog outside of their own institutional homepage, and it can be a really useful resource. Make sure you update your institutional or departmental homepage with your up-to-date publication history. And if your institution has a press office, make sure you use it. They can do a lot of really useful work in promoting your work. Definitely take the opportunity to promote your work at conferences. It's probably the best opportunity you'll get to go and talk to like-minded people and draw their attention to your work. There's also a handy service here called Grow Kudos, which is free. Go and check that out. It's all about how to promote your work and grow your profile as a researcher. But publishers can also play their part as well. So we might choose to promote your work as part of subject collection or highlights. So if you get the opportunity to include your work as, in some sort of collection, like a special issue or a highlights collection, definitely use it. These articles are often much more highly read and cited than regular articles. It makes it much easier to discover your work if it's included in those collections. We might highlight your interesting work through our Twitter channels. Our journals might have accounts, or they might be promoted at a sort of subject level. And we can also offer journalistic coverage of high-impact papers. So as I said, we have our websites like Nanotech Web or Physics World, where we can promote high-impact papers at more layman's terms. We can also press release newsworthy papers. So if you think your work might be worthy of a press release, get in touch with us before it gets accepted, because we might be able to get a press release out at the point of acceptance. So I'd like to take this opportunity to recap some of the topics that we've covered in this talk. So I gave you a quick introduction to IOP. As I mentioned, that we're a society publisher, and all of the profits that we make as a publisher go on to fund physics outreach within our communities. I talked a little bit about our IOP journals, the open access titles that we have, and those that the tiering of journals. So we have different impact factors in order to cover work from people of all career stages. I spoke a little about why you should publish at all, how peer review is an integral part of the scientific community. I spoke about choosing your journal, why it's really important to consider this before you write your article, because you are writing to a specific audience and you want to make sure that you take into account all of the requirements of your specific journal. I spoke to you about the open access options we have for German researchers. So the Max Planck Society and the TIB have agreements with us so that they will cover the cost of your open access. Make sure that you check out those options online. I'm going to leave the links on at the end of the presentation for you to explore. We spoke about writing your paper, how to structure your research, and spend plenty of time on that title and abstract. They are the shop window to your research and often a little bit neglected. Make sure you write them at the end of your paper once you know what results you're going to include, and make sure that they are easily discoverable through search engines. I spoke about the peer review process, the different types of peer review, such as single blind or double blind, and all the sort of things that we look out for as a publisher. I spoke to you about publication ethics, in particular plagiarism, how we routinely look out for that. And I spoke about what happens after you get accepted, what we look out for in terms of English language editing and things like that, and also how to promote your work. So definitely spend a little bit of time thinking about what you're going to do with your research once it's published. Who might be interested in reading it, and if it is worthy of a press release, get in touch with us, because we can help you put that together and write up your article in a more journalistic tone to make it accessible for non-experts. So a few of those handy links. Make sure you check out our publishing support site. The link is available there. It's got really helpful guidelines for navigating your way through the submission process, what we look out for at that stage, and also very handy information for referees. And if you are a member of the Max Planck Society and one of their affiliated institutions, we've got some handy guidelines for publishing open access there and how the costs will be covered. And also make sure, if you are a member of the TIB or you're not sure, check out that link there for a full list of institutions. And we also have some guidelines for how to publish open access through a TIB affiliated institute and how we'll cover your costs. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening, and I think we'll now be able to handle a few questions.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Tom, for a great presentation. So yeah, there's been a few questions asked during the webinar, so I'll just start with the first one. So we've had, can I post my manuscript on a preprint server before submitting it to a journal?
Absolutely. So for IOP journals, that's absolutely fine. In fact, we often encourage people to submit to the archive. And if something is on the archive already, you can submit straight from there to an IOP journal. It makes it really interesting. But if you are unsure whether a particular journal from another publisher supports this, make sure you check out their submission requirements, because some publishers have different policies regarding preprint servers. So make sure you check out the submission requirements for that journal online beforehand.
Okay, great, thank you. We've had another question about plagiarism. So the audience member asks, what would the threshold be for plagiarism through a system like Authenticate? Would two sentences copied verbatim, would that mean that the paper might be rejected?
So that's a very good question. We treat these on a case-by-case basis. So there's no strict threshold. And obviously we use common sense when looking at this. A few sentences is unlikely to result in the rejection of your work, because obviously there's only so many times that you can rewrite a particular method. So a few sentences probably unlikely to result in a rejection. But what I will say is that if you end up with more than a few sentences or continuous paragraphs copied from another source, then that is likely to cause issues. We may not reject the work straight away. We may come back to you and say, could you please rewrite this before we consider it further? But it is likely to add significant delays to your work. So make sure you check it beforehand.
Great, thank you, Tom. I think we've got time for just one more. So we've had a question posed by a member of the audience, which is, why might one choose to opt out of the open access publication option?
That's a very good question, actually. I think it would be very sensible to opt in if you are covered by the funding agreement, that is. So a lot of people opt out purely because they don't have funding to cover it. So not all institutions or funders will cover the costs of open access. So sometimes researchers might have to do it out of their own funding, which they might not be willing to do. So in that case, they'll opt to publish through a subscription basis instead. But I think if you do have an open access agreement in place with your institutional funder, definitely take up the offer, because it's likely to vastly increase how many people read your research. And I would also recommend checking your funders' requirements as well. Some funders will have a requirement in place that you publish open access. So make sure you check that out before deciding where you're going to publish.
Oh, great. Thank you, Tom. And thanks to everyone in the audience who asked the question. If your question hasn't been answered, we will contact you by email with an answer. And you might also want to check out the attachments in the handout section of the control panel, which contains some more information about those specific agreements that Tom has gone over. So that just leaves me to say thank you to Tom and to everyone who attended today's webinar. Once you leave, you will receive a survey about the presentation, and we'd really appreciate it if you could just complete those 3 short questions and provide some feedback to us. And you'll also receive a follow-up email within 48 hours, which will have a link to view the recording of today's webinar. So thank you very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. This webinar is now finished.